Some of you have been wondering why everything around you seems to be shifting. The people you used to lean on aren't there anymore. The doors you used to walk through have been shut in your face. The places that once brought you joy now feel empty. And you're asking God, why? I came to tell you, God knows you need a new path. Sometimes life throws disruptions that shake the very foundation of what we thought was certain. We make plans, set goals, and build routines only to have everything flipped upside down in a moment. It might be a job loss, a failed relationship, a financial crisis, or an internal restlessness that we just can't shake. When these disruptions come, our first instinct is often to resist, to hold on to what was, to fight to keep things the way they used to be. But what if the very thing that feels like a breakdown is actually a breakthrough? What if God is shaking things up because he sees something ahead that we can't see yet? God doesn't disrupt for the sake of chaos. He disrupts to redirect. He interrupts the familiar because he knows you're settling for less than what he has for you. Sometimes we become so comfortable with what we know that we miss the fact that the very place we're in is no longer serving us. And when God sees us stuck in places that are too small for our calling, he will shake things up to get us moving again. Think about the story of Abraham. He was living in his father's land, surrounded by his people, settled into a comfortable life. But God had a greater destiny for him. So what did God do? He disrupted his life with a command: leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. That disruption wasn't punishment. It was preparation. God was pulling him out of what was familiar to bring him into something far greater. But Abraham had to trust God enough to move. And that's where many of us struggle. We want the promise, but we resist the process. We want the blessing, but we fight against the breaking. We cry out for new opportunities, but when God starts to close doors, we panic. When things start falling apart, we try to put them back together instead of asking, Lord, what are you making new? But if we could shift our perspective, we'd realize that every divine disruption is an invitation to destiny. God knows what you need before you do. He knows when you've outgrown a season before you recognize it. And when you won't move on your own, he'll move things for you. The job that let you go, it wasn't rejection. It was redirection. The relationship that ended, it wasn't a loss. It was an exit sign pointing you toward healing and wholeness. The unexpected shift that caught you off guard, it wasn't an accident. It was an answer to a prayer you forgot. So don't resist the disruption. Lean into it. Trust that God never takes without the intention to give greater. What feels like the end of one chapter is simply the turning of a page into a destiny far beyond what you imagine. There comes a time in life when comfort becomes the very thing that holds you back. It feels good to stay where things are predictable, where the routines are familiar, where there are no risks to take and no challenges to face. But if you're going to step into the fullness of what God has for you, you have to understand that comfort and calling don't always walk hand in hand. Sometimes the very thing that makes you feel safe is the thing keeping you from growing. God did not create you to stay stuck in the same place, repeating the same cycles, living in the same patterns that do not challenge your faith. There's something inside of you that he has placed there, something greater, something bigger, something waiting to be birthed. But if you keep holding on to what is comfortable, you may never reach the calling he has assigned to your life. Look at Moses. He had settled into life in the wilderness tending sheep, far removed from the palace of Egypt where he was raised. He had found a rhythm, a place of safety, a predictable life where he no longer had to face the mistakes of his past. But then God showed up in a burning bush and disrupted his comfort. God called him to go back, to confront Pharaoh, to lead a nation out of bondage. That calling wasn't comfortable. It required courage. It required obedience. It required Moses to step into something he had never done before. And isn't that how God works? He calls us out of what is familiar into something that will stretch us, something that will demand more from us, something that will require faith instead of fear. Many of us have dreams, goals, and visions of what we want our lives to be, but we are trapped in comfort zones that keep us from stepping into the next level. We pray for change, yet we resist when change begins to happen. We ask God to open doors, yet we hesitate to walk through them when they require us to leave what we know behind. But calling demands movement. It demands action. It demands a willingness to leave behind the lesser for the greater. Think about Peter when Jesus called him to walk on water. As long as Peter stayed in the boat, he was comfortable, he was safe, but the miracle didn't happen in the boat. The miracle happened when he stepped out, and though the waves were high and the wind was strong, as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he walked where no man had walked before. The same is true for you. Your next level is not inside the place you refuse to leave. What God has for you will require you to step out in faith, to let go of comfort, to embrace the unknown, and to trust that He is leading you to something greater than you could ever imagine. There comes a time when the very thing that once sustained you no longer satisfies you. The job that once excited you now feels draining. The relationship that once brought joy now feels stagnant. The environment that once nurtured your growth now feels too small for the person you're becoming. And when this happens, it's not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that God is shifting you. God never intended for you to stay in one place forever. He is a God of movement, a God of seasons, a God who takes you from glory to glory. But too often we hold on to what is familiar even when we can feel deep inside that it's no longer working. We try to make something last beyond its season. We force doors to stay open when God is trying to close them. But when the old path dries up, it's time to move. Look at the story of Elijah at the brook of Cherith. God sent him there, and for a time the brook provided water, and the ravens brought him food. It was a place of provision. It was a place of sustenance. But then one day the brook dried up. The water stopped flowing. And God didn't tell Elijah to stay and pray for more water. He told him to get up and go to Zarephath, where the next level of provision was waiting. If Elijah had stayed at that dry brook, he would have perished. The same is true for us. There are places in our lives that served a purpose for a season. They were necessary. They were a blessing. But when that season is over, we have to be willing to move. If the doors are closing, if the opportunities are disappearing, if the resources are running dry, don't fight to hold on to what God is trying to release you from. If He allowed it to dry up, it's because He has something better ahead. The problem is we often confuse a dried up brook with failure. We think that because something is ending, it means we did something wrong. But what if it's not a failure? What if it's a transition? What if God is pulling you out of something small so He can bring you into something greater? Sometimes He will let things become uncomfortable just to push you into movement. He knows that if He doesn't allow the brook to dry up, you might never leave. The real test of faith is whether you trust Him enough to move when He says move. Can you walk away from what is no longer working even when you don't see the next step clearly? Can you release what was so you can receive what is coming? Don't stay stuck in a dry place trying to force life into something that is no longer meant to sustain you. When the old path dries up, that's your sign. It's time to step into the new thing God has prepared for you. You cannot step into a new season with an old mindset. You cannot embrace what God is doing next while clinging to the way things have always been. A new path requires a new way of thinking, a new way of believing, and a new level of faith. But too often, we ask God for a new opportunity while holding on to old patterns. We pray for open doors, but carry the same fears, the same doubts, and the same habits that kept us stuck before. God will never put new wine in old wineskins. He knows that if he pours something fresh into a vessel that hasn't changed, the weight of the blessing will break it. That's why he works on your mind before he moves you to a new level. Before he shifts your circumstances, he shifts your thinking. Before he takes you to a new place, he makes sure you have the capacity to sustain it. Because if your mind is not renewed, you'll sabotage the very thing you prayed for. Look at the Israelites. God brought them out of Egypt, but Egypt was still in their minds. They were no longer slaves, but they still thought like slaves. They were free, but they still operated in fear. And because their mindset never shifted, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, delaying the promise that God had already prepared for them. It wasn't their enemies that kept them out, it was their thinking. And the same is true for many of us. It's not that God hasn't made a way. It's not that he hasn't opened doors. But if we don't change the way we see ourselves, if we don't believe we are worthy of what he's calling us to, we will keep circling the same mountains, never stepping fully into the new path he has prepared. A new mindset requires letting go of limiting beliefs. It requires breaking free from the voices that told you what you couldn't do, what you couldn't be, what you couldn't achieve. It requires shifting from a survival mentality to a faith mentality, from fear to expectation, from doubt to confidence. You cannot carry a defeated mind into a victorious future. You cannot move forward while constantly looking back. When God calls you to something new, he expects you to think differently. He expects you to speak differently. He expects you to believe differently, because the level you're stepping into requires more than what got you through the last season. It requires a mind that is stretched, a faith that is strengthened, and a heart that is open to change. So don't resist the process. Don't fight the renewal that God is trying to bring to your thinking. The new path you've been praying for is already there, but it will take a new mindset to walk in it, to sustain it, and to fully receive everything that God has in store for you. Faith is not about seeing first and then believing. It is about believing first, even when there is no evidence, even when nothing makes sense. Even when everything around you tells you it won't work, faith walks before it sees. It steps out when there is no proof, when there is no confirmation, when there is no visible sign that things will change. It moves forward when logic says stay still, when fear says turn back, and when doubt says it's impossible. When God calls you to something greater, he rarely shows you the full picture. He gives you a word, a promise, a direction, but he doesn't always give you the details, because if he showed you everything up front, you wouldn't need faith. If you could see exactly how things would unfold, you wouldn't have to trust him. But faith is about moving when you don't know how it will work out. It's about obeying before you understand. It's about trusting the voice of God more than the reality of your situation. Look at Abraham. God told him to leave his father's house and go to a land that he would show him. God didn't give him a map. He didn't lay out every step in advance. He simply said, go. And Abraham went. He didn't see the promise yet, but he walked in faith. He didn't have the full picture, but he moved forward anyway. And because he was willing to walk before he saw, he became the father of many nations. Think about Peter when he stepped out of the boat. The storm was raging, the waves were high, and the wind was strong. But when Jesus said, come, Peter didn't wait for the storm to stop before stepping out. He didn't wait for the water to turn into solid ground. He simply walked. And as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he did the impossible. That is what faith looks like. It moves before the conditions are perfect. It believes before the breakthrough comes. It trusts before the answer is revealed. Some of us are waiting to see before we walk. We want every detail, every confirmation, every sign before we take a step. But faith doesn't work that way. Faith requires action. It requires movement. It requires obedience even when the path is unclear. You can't wait for the circumstances to be ideal before you trust God. You can't wait for everything to make sense before you move forward. The miracle is in the movement. The breakthrough is in the step. If you're waiting for everything to be perfect before you trust, you'll never move. If you're waiting for all the answers before you obey, you'll never walk in your calling. Faith goes first. It steps into the unknown. It moves forward knowing that even if the path isn't visible yet, God is already there, making a way where there seems to be no way. When God shifts you to a new path, it's never just about you. It's bigger than your comfort, bigger than your plans, bigger than your personal desires. The next path God is calling you to is designed to impact more than just your life. It's connected to generations, to people you haven't met yet, to places you haven't seen yet, to assignments that will stretch you beyond what you think you're capable of. Too often we think small because we only see ourselves. We measure the next step by what we think we can handle, by what we feel prepared for, by what seems manageable in our own strength. But when God calls you, He doesn't call you to something that fits inside the limits of your own abilities. He calls you to something that requires Him. He calls you to something that will stretch your faith, enlarge your capacity, and challenge the way you see yourself. Look at Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, he felt unqualified. He looked at his limitations, his speech, his past, his insecurities. But God wasn't concerned about Moses' comfort. This calling wasn't just about Moses. It was about delivering a nation. It was about shifting generations. It was about fulfilling a promise that was made long before Moses was even born. And that's how God works. The path He's calling you to isn't just about what you want. It's about what He's purposed. Your next path is bigger than you because it's not just about what you can accomplish. It's about what God wants to do through you. It's about the lives that will be changed because of your obedience. It's about the doors that will open for others because you had the courage to walk through yours. It's about breaking generational cycles, shifting mindsets, and setting a new standard for those coming after you. This is why you can't afford to stay in a place of doubt and hesitation. This is why fear cannot be the thing that holds you back, because your obedience isn't just for you, it's for the people connected to your destiny. Someone is waiting for you to say yes. Someone is waiting for you to step into the calling you've been avoiding. Someone's breakthrough is tied to your movement. God is not asking you to be ready. He's asking you to be willing. He's asking you to trust Him enough to step forward even when you feel inadequate. He's asking you to believe that His strength is greater than your weakness. He's asking you to stop looking at what you lack and start looking at the one who is able. The path ahead of you is bigger than your fears, bigger than your past, and bigger than your excuses. And if you trust God enough to walk it, you'll see that it was never just about you. It was always about something greater than you could ever imagine